Hi everybody. All right, here we go. This is for the 2020 AP World History exam. This is our third DBQ practice, so this is DBQ number 3. So before we do this one, if you have not already gone on to Mrs. Hall's website on the homepage, printed off DBQ number 3. This should be for Thursday, May 7th. You should have printed it. You should have practiced it. Remember, we're writing our first one next week, or our first one for this practice, the 5 document one next week, but this is our third practice one where you're setting the timer for 15 minutes and you're going through and you're doing the document analysis, grouping, SOAPs, contextualization, and outside sources, just kind of doing that real good outline of the essay, and then you're going over the video to kind of get an idea of how many points you would earn without actually writing it. And then next week we'll do a full write, okay? So before you go through this video, it is really worthless if you aren't actually practicing the planning. What do you have to lose to practice the planning? It's lazy if you're jumping straight to the review and you're not actually doing the practice, all right? So take the 15 minutes, and do that. All right, so here we go. We're jumping in. All right. If you had a feeling from this one of kind of walking away from the grouping and you're like, never quite feeling solid on it, that is okay. All right. This one, the documents, there was a whole bunch of which way and that way, and you're going to see that when we do the grouping. So I liked this one because it created a lot of confusion. So this is part of why I chose this one. The reason I didn't choose this one first is you weren't ready with it. If you notice, the first DBQ we did was very solid. Second one, slight confusion, right? Solid documents, that one. This one, several documents that weren't solid, okay? And so I meant to throw you that curveball. So if you walked away from the grouping and some of the document analysis and you were feeling a little bit like, ooh, this one I'm not feeling great about it, I wanted you to have that feeling. Why? Well, because sometimes that's the case. Some documents you're going to feel great on, some you won't, okay? And so we're kind of building up to this, all right? So we're going to go through these, and not all DBQs are straightforward. Sometimes they're going to be hard to analyze, and you're going to have to do your best, and that's kind of the reality, and that's kind of more what we want to prep for, okay? So here we go. All right, the prompt was evaluate the extent to which rulers of Indian states could exercise power independently from the British in the period of 1750 to 1900. All right, so first thing we got to think about is like, what do we know about this? So we always want to kind of stop and think like, what do I know about this prompt? Okay, Indian states, so we're talking about India, okay? British rule in India, 1750 to 1900. So you should immediately be jumping to imperialism, the BEIC, the British East India Company, Sepoy Rebellion, 1857, 1858, when then it switched to, the Viceroy. Remember how they were the crown jewel of India, cotton, they were the staple of imperialism, industrial revolution, the need for raw goods, opium wars, smuggling opium into China. I mean, India was at the heart of this colonization, white man's burden. Remember, colonies had two purposes. Either they were used for raw goods or relocation. And we know India was the quintessential colony for raw goods, right? You had workers already in place, and so it was the number one example of imperialism and places that was used and abused by a European nation. Remember, we had the Indian Civil Service exam. We had those examples of technology. We're going to modernize you because we love you, right? Bringing in the railroads, and I mean, we know a lot about this. This is actually a really great prompt that you should know a lot about. Now, grouping. So first thing before we get into the documents, we won't know the groups, but we have to try to remember, we brainstorm what could those groups be. So evaluate what? The extent. So we know the prompt is going to be about these Indian states and to what extent they were ruled by the British. So remember, the Mongols actually, which were Muslim, ruled India at the time the British arrived and other Europeans arrived. So you actually already had that Muslim-Hindu conflict going on. So the question is, to what extent did the British rule? So we know the British didn't have a huge presence there. All they really cared about was extracting the economic resources. So they tried to limit their political presence there, and we know that for the first 100 years they didn't even have a political presence. They ruled through the BEIC, right? And then only after the Sepoy Rebellion and that whole mess did they switch over to the Viceroy and have more of a political presence. So a lot of people were independent. They had economic relationships. They had tributaries. There was all different varying relationships of rule by the British and how much they could extract economics. Okay, so extent is going going to kind of be that key word, to what extent. So some documents we might see, that they're totally controlled. Others, maybe they can ward off the British. Some, the relationship status might be, it's complicated. You know what I mean? Like maybe it's not clear cut. So you're looking for, to what extent do we see the British having a grasp or control? So kind of see it as like a measure, maybe a large extent, little extent, maybe no, maybe none. So maybe independence or fighting them or resisting them. Maybe you might see working with them, or it's complicated or tributary, or you might see total rule or direct rule. So maybe kind of keep some of those things in mind. And we'll look at source and obviously verbiage of the documents for those kind of things. So to what extent? So all the documents will deal with that, but to what extent? So we want to keep that in mind for grouping. We'll look at source, finding those quotes that would prove the extent, right, or support what we feel the extent is. We're going to summarize that, and then we'll go over SOAP's ideas, at the end. All right, so here we go. So we'll go through the documents first, and we'll kind of get those ideas. We'll go over the grouping ideas, which that is where there was a lot of confusion. You'll see that as we go through the documents. And then at the end, we'll go over the SOAPs, which was more straightforward, the contextualization outside. The SOAPs, contextualization outside source, those were all very straightforward. The grouping, document analysis, those were the much harder aspect of this prompt. So on one hand, this prompt is great for outside source contextualization. This should be great. You should be like, oh yeah, imperialism, support rebellion, the Industrial Revolution, like all kinds of things you could talk about. But as far as like grouping and things, these documents were definitely on the difficult side. And that I chose that because if you aren't struggling, you're not learning. Okay, so there was a reason for that. All right, so here we go. Okay, so this one actually gave you some historical backgrounds. They were saying from 1750 to 1900, the East Indian Company and Great Britain controlled. So the East India Company is the BEIC. That's who they're talking about, okay? Controlled Great Britain in some parts of India directly and other parts indirectly through treaties and alliances. So they're talking about the princely states. So they're talking about the Mongols. They're talking about Indian princes. They're talking about tributaries. They're talking about the BEIC. So they're saying basically, again, what I was talking about earlier, that some were direct rule, they tried as much as possible, and we talked about that, to not directly rule because it was expensive, They tried as much as they could to use what was already in place and just rule through them as much as possible. It was cheaper. All they really cared about was getting the economic resources. So this was just kind of to give you an idea of geographically how broken up it was and how complicated it really was. This isn't one of the documents. This is meant just to give you. Now, originally, this was a 7-document DBQ, and like I said, I pared it down to a 5. Okay, document 1. Source, this is Muhammad, ruler of a southeast Indian state. This is a letter to the director of the BEIC, 1777. So this is before the Sepoy Rebellion. He's saying, sir, I've served you for 5 years. Positive, I invaded the state. I took my troops that you lent me for 3 years. I've kept my promise. The second paragraph, he basically is talking about all the things he did on his behalf. He's paid loans. He's paid soldiers. He's taken over things. He's paid off debt. He's basically bragging on himself. This third paragraph, you start to see his point, okay? He talks about here, let me see where it says, third line, okay? Nonetheless, I cannot conclude this letter without noting that by changing your mind and now insisting the Prince of Tanjore be restored. So here's basically what's happening, okay? He was asked 5 years ago to invade this neighboring state, Tanjore, and take over with troops provided to him by the BEIC, all right, to take over, get things in place, and to do all these things, get things done. And he's done it, and he's writing this letter. I've done it, and I've done a really good job, and I've paid people off. I've used my own money. I've done you proud, so to speak, right? I've been a good tributary. I've been a good soldier. I've done what I'm supposed to do. Now it sounds like he's writing this letter because he's gotten word that he's going to be replaced, so to speak. If you look at the middle of the last paragraph, reinstating the Prince of Tanjore is just the same as inviting the French into this country. So basically what he's been told is that he's going to be replaced, and he's trying to say, you remove me and put basically this old leadership back in place. That's like asking the French to come in here. It's undoing all the good things we've done. Why would you do this? Last line. Whereas, should it remain in my hands, I will make sure that no part of the wealth of this country falls into the hands of our common enemy. So he's trying to show we have an alliance. Look, we're in this together. I'm on your side. Okay, so this is definitely showing the extent of British rule in India, that there's a close connection. They are closely hand in hand. He is working in conjunction with, for the British, and he's fighting on their behalf. Now, he is definitely fighting for himself in this case. He doesn't want to be replaced, but he's trying to appeal to the British that you replace me, you're basically getting rid of your alliance, your allegiance, and that this will no longer be in your interest. So this document, the extent, you definitely see a close tight-knit rule with the British and connection to the British in this document for sure. Okay, document 2, pictures. Yay, these usually go pretty quick, okay, especially battle scenes. Here we go. Source, this is an Indian artist seen on the wall depicting a battle. Here we go. So we just want to know who won the battle, all right? So this is an Indian state defeated an army of the British East India Company, the BEIC, okay? So this is basically where an Indian state defeated the BEIC, so where the British have been defeated. This painting was used to decorate a palace of the rulers of Mysore. So this is showing an extent where the British are not ruling. So this is opposite of document 1. So this extent is no rule. This is independence, right? So the extent is independence or rejection or warfare, however you want to see it. Total opposite of the first document. First document is working together, working in conjunction together. This one is independence, warfare, rejection, and victory. So not even warfare, but victory, right? Independence or victory over the British. They have pushed off the, and I like how they say that it's a painting that they've displayed in a palace. So for soaps, I would imagine that this is the purpose of this is like showing off, bragging. You know what I mean? This is this is an easy soaps. To me, all day long, this is purpose, because right there in source, they say that it's used to decorate the palace. What's the purpose of decoration? Showing off. People go, oh, what is this? And you go right into, oh yeah, when we kicked a little British butt. Who doesn't love to brag? Especially when they tend to be the underdogs and the British are supposed to be these great warriors. So this document all day long is really easy to interpret. Okay, it's a little late. I'm not talking very well. All right, let's keep going. Document 3, here we go. Source, okay. This is leader of the Mysore, a letter to the Mughal emperor. So this is between two Indian leaders. Okay, so this is not between the British. So this should be interesting. Your Majesty, receiving your letters and gifts, especially has honored me and acknowledged me your letters and gifts. I respectfully humbly alliance and obedience. As a steadfast believer in desiring, like you and others, the religion of Muhammad. So they are claiming a similar belief in Muhammad, so Islam. So we know that they are both Muslim. Okay, I have taken upon myself in recent years to chastise and drive away the adherent Christianity and especially the wicked English from these parts of India, unable to continue fighting me in the wars. So here's basically saying, he's saying, I agree with you, and I have made it a big thing that us both as Muslims, we need to get rid of the Christians, especially the wicked English from India. This is such a well-known fact that it hardly needs to be mentioned. With the divine aid and blessing of God, I am now again firmly committed to the total destruction of the enemies of faith and their extradition from India. So this letter is clearly like a friendship. We're in alliance together. This is a rejection of victory over the British, a celebration of not only their commonality of religion, but their commonality of the hatred for another religion, Christianity, but not just that, really the English, you know what I mean? And getting them out of India and their commitment to getting them out of here, okay? If you look at the middle of that paragraph, the English begged me for peace in the most abject manner, okay? So this one definitely, what extent? The British have no extent, right? This one is claiming that basically the British were begging for mercy, all right? Begging for mercy in warfare. So kind of like document 2, the extent, I feel like these two kind of have something in common, right? They're showing victory in warfare, or definitely where the British were not victorious in warfare, or little to no extent over, independence or victory in warfare. So you definitely see a commonality there, and you see it in the verbiage as well. Okay, document 4. Again, always start with source. If you guys are not noticing that, whenever I go over the documents, when you start with source, it makes the document so much easier, and it guides you towards your grouping so much faster. So if you're skipping that, you are not working smart, okay? Especially with the limited time that you have. All right, source, here we go. This is a queen of northern India. All right, go down to this. So it's a proclamation to her people announcing her support for the Sepoy Rebellion. This is why we read source. You should know Sepoy Rebellion, okay? If you don't, what the heck? You know what that means when I say that. It means I'm giving you eyes, okay? 1, we talked about this in detail. 2, this was in the Heimler videos, and this was in the timeline review for this Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So if you're like, oh, what the heck? This was in the videos. Okay, you should know this, all right? You should know this, you should know this, all right? So support, if you don't, go back and Google it. You got to know this, all right? Imperialism in India, like this is classic, all right? You got to know it. So right there, reading the source, you should know the direction this is going. So if she's supporting the Sepoy Rebellion, and it says to her fellow Indian rulers, clearly we know what side of the Sepoy Rebellion she's on. Okay, she's a queen in northern India, and it's to her fellow Indian rulers, and she's supporting the Sepoy Rebellion. So clearly she's supporting the cause of the Sepoys, right, against the British. All right, jump down. Third paragraph, okay, it says, it has now become evident to all men that the English are enemies of our religions, plural, okay? And she does in the second, the Hindus and Muslim religions, by the production and circulation of the religious through the medium of missionaries, are being destroyed, our own religions. So she's making really clear that the English are attacking both Hindu and Muslim religions, because remember, Indian rulers were both Hindu and Muslims, okay? Because you had the Mongols and you had some native Hindu rulers as well. So she's making really clear her support for internal rebellion against the British, okay? So the extent of their rule is being challenged. So it's not necessarily that they've been overthrown, but she's showing her support for rebelling against their rule in areas where they do have control. So this one is kind of an in-between. It's not showing necessarily the extent of British rule, and it's not showing victory over British rule. So it's not quite like document 1. It's not showing allegiance at all, but it's not like documents 2 and 3 where it's showing victory over them. It's showing support for rebellion against British rule to some extent, right? Internal rebellion against them. And it's saying, we need to, they have been disrespectful to us. And she goes over, by abolishing our ancestor customs, and third, by favoring and promoting these Indians who embrace the Christian faith. So, I mean, she goes on and lists, many different reasons and stuff. So this one is kind of an in-between where it's like there's a call to action, but the action is happening, and it's an internal rebellion, and we know that the Sepoy Rebellion, technically in the end, the British were successful, right? The BEIC was out, but the British just grasped on harder by doing a really good, media campaign and winning people over and buying them over with technology and just getting more of what they wanted, kind of, pacifying them, buying them over, so to speak. So this one's kind of an in-between of a call to action, but it's internally, and it's not necessarily a victory. Okay, document 5, last one, okay? So this is a ruler in the north, a letter to the ruler of Afghanistan. Okay, so this document's really interesting, but read the last part of this. And it's toward the end of the timeline, so it's after the Sepoy Rebellion. So this would be when the BEIC is gone and the British are now directly controlling India through a viceroy, right, or as directly as they've been, okay? The letter was intercepted by the British colonial authorities. Whoops! Hate it when that happens, right? Hate it when that happens, when letters get intercepted. That's never what we want, okay? So this is a practical difference between the British and the Russian Empire. So here's basically what was happening. This ruler is, I'm going to sum this document up just to save us time, okay? So we're not reading the whole thing because you should have already read it, okay? So paragraph 1 is saying basically that here's what this ruler knows. This ruler knows that he's going down. You're like, well, how do you know that? Well, look at his verbiage, okay? In no way, shape, or form is he talking about independence. He's talking about the pros and cons of who are we going to be tributaries to? Who's it better to fall subject to? Is it better to be a tributary to the Russian Empire or to the British? And what does he conclude? Russia. He's basically saying, and so at this time, Russia had interest in Afghanistan. So that's why he was writing the letter to Afghanistan, because they had connections to Russia. Okay, so that's why. And if you fast forward to the Cold War, Russia still had connections to Afghanistan. Russia still has connections to Afghanistan even today, all right? So that relationship goes way back, way back. So the reason this letter was being written to Afghanistan is because it was the closest connection to the Russian Empire for India through an alliance, okay? So they're basically saying they're going down, okay? They're in the northern territory, so they're kind of writing this letter, kind of going, well, if we're going to fall, they're kind of appeasing, saying, it's our understanding that, if we were to fall, at least falling to them, who has an alliance with Afghanistan, saying, if we fall to the people, so this is to a ruler of Afghanistan saying, hey, if we fall to the people that you have an alliance with, here's what it would be like, versus the British, and it's going over all these negative things. So in a way, this is basically showing the extent of British rule is that they're going to fall to British rule. They're just hoping they can avoid it by falling to Russian rule first, or being intimidated by Russian rule and pushing off the British. But they are going to fall. So they are falling, and the extent of this is that they're going to fall and become a tributary of the British if Russia doesn't step in and take them first, all right? And they know they're going to fall. They're just wishing, and so to speak, the lesser of two evils, okay? So the extent, this one can be really hard to interpret because it's like they haven't quite been taken over yet, but it's going to be taken over, and the extent hasn't happened yet, but it's going to happen, all right? And the fact it's being intercepted, the British are now going to probably act much quicker. You know what I mean? So I see this one as the extent is going to be, you know, he's already implying they can't withhold the British, and so they would like to avoid the British, but they know it's going to happen if they don't fall to the Russians first, okay? And in some ways, they're kind of begging to the Afghan rulers, like, hey, dangle the carrot, maybe they'll want to come for us first, okay? Because the British are in the territory. But they know they can't withstand. Okay, grouping. Here we go. As you can see, it's a bit of a mess. There's a lot of possibilities. Here's what it comes down to on the AP exam. Your ability to discuss, okay? How good of a salesman are you? How good of a salesman are you? How good can you discuss how good can you sell it? All right, so let's talk about the first opportunity. All right, here's the first one, okay? So here's the first option. So first option, group one could be documents that are in conjunction, so working with or possible tributaries of the British. So the extent is that the control the British could have over them is pretty great. Document 1 shows directly the extent they have over them is great, and document 5 is implying that the British could have great extent over them if the Russians don't step in. So 1 is showing it directly and 1 is implying it. So that is why they could be grouped together. Okay, group 2. Direct independence, or you could say rebellion or warfare or success, however, whatever term you want to put on that, independence or successful warfare against them, however you want to put it. Document 2 shows the painting of that, and document 3 clearly shows the British begging for peace, right? So those are very straightforward. Document 4 was kind of the rebel in this one. If you grouped those two, then it's like, what do you do with document 4? Because it doesn't show clear victory like 2 and 3, so you can't really put it with that. If you're doing clear independence warfare, you can't really put it with 1 and 5 because it's not quite tributary in conjunction. It's showing rebellion, it's internal revolt. So you kind of have this weird outlier. So this would be kind of this weird third group where you would put it in its own single paragraph, short paragraph, where I would talk about call to action, internal revolt, where there is control by the British, but it's being questioned and it's transitioning right from the BEIC to the Viceroy. Okay. Second possibility, just clear, straightforward 2 groups, okay? So first group doesn't really change, okay? So the in conjunction tributary or future tributary, basically document 1 again shows that direct relationship, very, very clear. Document 5 implies that they will fall to the British. They might not like it, but that is what's going to happen. They make it very clear they would prefer Russian rule, but they're going to fall to the British, okay? They can't withstand that. So they will be tributaries of or working with the British, whether they like it or not. So document 1 is directly showing that, and document 5 is implying that, okay? And then rebellion is the theme of 2, 3, and 4. So what I did is I kind of took the successful warfare aspect of 2 and 3, and I broadened it to the idea of the Sepoy rebellion, and just created the theme of warfare. So whether or not it was successful, the action of warfare, right? So 2 showed warfare, 3, the act of warfare and peace, and 4, the rebellion, okay? So warfare, rebellion, I kind of broadened it to create that theme. So this one, I don't think quite shows quite as much insight, but it can work, okay? So if you just want to kind of just simplify, this was one way to do it. Okay, another way, this one was probably the one that I came up with. Let me put it this way. This is the order I came up with them, okay? So if you came up with them in a different order, if you saw them in a different order, it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. This is just how I saw it, okay? So this was kind of the last one that I saw, but this is a possibility, okay? So flip it all around, all right? So your 2 solid groups, so one group could be, so actually I probably should have done these in a different order. So do group 3 as your first group, so to speak. Internal scheming or rebellion, document 4 and 5. So document 4, we see it, right? We see the rebellion. the Sepoy Rebellion. Okay, document 5, we see the scheming of trying to reach out to the Russians, and the letter being intercepted by the British. So they know they're going to be taken over, but they're trying to avoid it being the British. So even though there is the act of war, the fact that they're reaching out to the Afghanistan leader, the Afghan rulers, and trying to kind of entice the Russian takeover tributary versus the British, is an act of rebellion and scheming. So you could kind of find that internal connection. Again, document 2 and 3 coming together, that independence, success, complete, break. So the extent is none, from the British. And then you could find the one document that could remain solar where you do see a true tributary or in conjunction rule. So the extent is very close with the British. Okay, so that is another way that you could do it. So basically taking document 5 and taking the fact that they were trying to sneak around the British, and that scheming, the internal scheming, and document 4, the fact that it was an internal rebellion, and finding that internal aspect of it, the uprooting of scheming and rebelling, and finding that link between it and creating a group from that. Okay, so that is why I said this one, as far as like grouping and document analysis, this is a harder one. So if you struggle with this or you saw different opportunities, here's why. It all comes down to how well do you discuss it. Okay, all right. Let's go through the rest of this pretty quick because it is more straightforward. SOAPs. All right, document 1, basically anything goes. Speaker, I think, is really good. Audience, he is talking to the British. Okay, speaker is really clear. It's a tributary, of the British. Audience, clear is British rule. Occasion is he's being replaced. He's trying to prove himself. Purpose, he doesn't want to be replaced. He's trying to prove his worth. I mean, so all day long, really any of those would work. Okay, document 2, audience is anyone who wants to see the victory. Purpose is to gloat, it's a picture, so I like that one. Document 3, same thing. I think audience is really good, or purpose. Document 4, this is that call to action, so the occasion is the Sepoy Rebellion, and then the purpose is to rally the troops to gain support. They are stronger in numbers against the big bad British, so I think, occasion is the violations of these religions, and then purpose is, the rally in numbers. And then document 5, speaker, I think can work. Audience, I think is really interesting, and purpose, I think, is probably the strongest on document 5, which is to avoid British rule and have the lesser of two evils. So talking about how they're going to fall no matter what, but they see the Russians as less oppressive than the British. So I think purpose would probably be my choice on document 5 if I had to choose. Okay, contextualization, and like I've said before, a lot of these could actually, if you didn't use them in contextualization, could be used in outside source. Okay, so I'm not going to repeat all of these in outside source. Just know that you can't double dip, but some of these could be used in outside source as well. Okay, imperialism, what it is, the heart of it, right? The domination of one country over another, economically, politically, culturally, and stuff. The start of westernization. You could talk about the BEIC and how they were the start of British rule, or the start of the extent of British rule in India. So you could kind of talk about that original rule. You could talk about Mughal rule before the BEIC. So you could talk about the precursor to British rule in India and how it was Mughal rule, the mixing of Hindu and Muslim religions. You could talk about colonization and how that started, this whole movement in the backbone of imperialism. The Industrial Revolution, the need for raw goods, and how that fed imperialism and colonization, which led to the colonization of India, and how it was a raw goods colony, right? It was not a relocation colony. The technological advancements that made it possible. You could talk about how Britain led the way, the sun never set, and how India was the crown jewel of all the colonies really in the world, the crown jewel of Britain. Raw goods was the motivation, and that cotton was the #1 motive, and India was the #1 producer of cotton. So that kind of made India the #1 colonies of all the colonies in the world at that time. And exploration age is what brought this whole contact about, right? That when the Mongols moved in there, when originally the Portuguese and then eventually the Spanish and the British and the Dutch and the French and other nations that had contact with India, it all started with exploration and trade and trying to find those direct accesses to trade, cutting out the middleman, right? Cutting out the Muslim, Middle Eastern, Mediterranean merchants, Italian merchants, and having direct access to trade. So any of those things would work for contextualization, okay? All right, outside source. So like I said, a lot of those things I just listed under contextualization could work. Sepoy Rebellion. So I understand document 4 talks about the Sepoy Rebellion, but so what would work is not necessarily mentioning the Sepoy Rebellion, but if you talked about the causes of the Sepoy Rebellion. So if you went specifically into what a Sepoy is, that's an Indian soldier who served in the British Army, or if you talked about specifically, if you talked about like remember the cartridges and the rumors about the animal fat and how that was laced and they would have to bite on that. So if it was pork or beef and how that was religious violations. If you talked about the BEIC in general, you could talk about them. If you talked about a viceroy, how they replaced the BEIC. If you talked about the Indian Civil Service exam, that would be a great one, and how messed up that was. You could go forward with that and Gandhi and the Indian independence movement. You could talk about the conflict between Muslims and Hindus. So there's reference to Hindus and Muslims and how they're kind of coming together, but actually we know from history that 99% of the time there was so much conflict between them. That was one of the biggest. The British was a big obstacle in their independence movement, but their own internal conflict was actually the bigger obstacle at times. Opium is not mentioned in all this. Opium, the Opium Wars, and how opium was smuggled into China. And so India was the supplier of that. Everything from the contextualization list, like I said. So any of those things, again, you just can't double dip, okay? So contextualization is kind of leading up to the prompt. Remember, outside source can be anything relating to the topic, so before, during, after. So it is possible with outside source to go outside the timeline, so to go past 1900 if you wanted. So that's where like Gandhi, independence movement, the Hindu-Muslim conflict, you could go past that if you wanted, or go a little bit beyond that, like opium, because India was the source of the opium, you could tie that as well. Okay, or if you came up with something maybe that I missed or something like that, you could always email me and double check that, because like I said, I'm sure there's things I missed. I do sometimes. So any questions and anything like that? Hopefully you're learning, you're getting stuff, you're learning from these things, and with each one you're getting better at it. Hopefully what you're getting from this is source is so important. You got to skim the documents, find those, reading the prompt up front, having ideas of what your grouping could be, getting those hints from the prompt, getting those, keywords. In this case it was extent, and then looking at source and reading it. It doesn't mean you always know it exactly, but going through the documents, you should see clues. You should get to the end and have no clue. That means you have not worked smart going through the documents. So it's something we got to keep practicing. Okay, and then beginning of next week, our 4th DBQ, we will be writing. Okay, so you will set the timer 45 minutes, and you will not only plan, but you will write an entire DBQ. Okay, so email me with questions, and that's it for tonight. All right, or for today. All right, since I'm recording this Thursday night. All right, thank you so much.